They said my lake was a hazard, so I turned their perfectly pruned neighborhood into a rotting swamp. The HOA president stood knee-deep in backed-up sewage, screaming like it was my sprinkler that flooded her precious marble floors. Miriam Dorsey claimed my lake was a threat to public safety, but you'll want to stick around to find out what she was actually hiding behind those HOA violations and fake smiles. One drained lake, one buried secret, and an entire subdivision drowning in its own mess? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, because this revenge, oh, it gets messy fast. It all started with a clipboard and a condescending tone. I was sitting in the old wooden chair my dad built back in the 80s overlooking Lake Oliver, just like I had every morning since cancer took him. That lake was more than a pond. It was memory, patience, peace. It's where I came to breathe after long shifts at the outdoor gear shop and longer weeks surviving divorce court. But peace doesn't sit well with people like Miriam. She strutted up my gravel driveway in designer heels, trailed by two HOA board members who looked like they'd been voluntold. "Mr. Briggs, we need to address your situation," she said, like my lake had been caught stealing catalytic converters. Her voice had the warmth of a DMV speaker and all the empathy of wet drywall. I told her the lake's been here 40 years. Never caused a flood, not even during that big storm back in '97 when the rest of the county turned into an indoor pool. Didn't matter. Miriam pulled out her clipboard like it was the Ten Commandments and pointed to section 14.2, no bodies of standing water that pose risk to adjacent properties. She acted like the water had a criminal record, slapped a $500 0-cent fine on my tackle box, and smiled the way a cat does when it knocks over your coffee. From the sidewalk, Susan Phelps and her little gaggle of HOA disciples whispered and pointed, like the lake had personally insulted their begonias. "That thing's a flood waiting to happen," Susan called out, adjusting her sunglasses with the flair of a local news anchor audition. I glanced at Cliff Reynard, one of the quieter board members, hoping he might speak up. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something reasonable, then Miriam snapped, "Unless you'd like us to revisit your unauthorized mailbox color, Cliff?" That shut him down like a bad Wi-Fi signal, and just like that, my lake deal, my sanctuary, was condemned by people who thought a maple leaf in the gutter was a state emergency. Then, like a surprise witness in a courtroom drama, Kendra Lowell walked over from 2 doors down, still in her banking heels. "Morning, Colton," she said, her voice soft but sharp. "Let me guess, another HOA hit job?" Miriam turned to her like she'd spotted mold in a marble kitchen. "You've also been fined," she snapped. "Your tree extends over the property line by 2 inches. Kendra raised an eyebrow and said, "That tree's been here since the Reagan administration. You just noticed it now?" Her words were calm, but her eyes carried that quiet rage only polite people truly master. That night, I found myself in the garage, digging through a pile of old binders my dad left behind. HOA stuff he kept just in case, because he never trusted people who smiled too much at meetings. I scanned the pages by flashlight, breathing dust and frustration, until I hit gold. A copy of the 1993 HOA Rulebook, Section 8, Annual Infrastructure Inspections Required, including for drainage and water flow systems. I knew for a fact those hadn't been done in at least 5 years. They'd skipped inspections to save money, probably funneled the funds into flower beds or catering for those board meetings nobody actually attends. And just when the smallest flicker of hope sparked, I heard something outside. An engine, rumbling, low, steady. I walked to the window and saw it. A truck backing up to the edge of my lake. No permits, no notices, just hoses in the water, pumps running under cover of darkness. That was the moment I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. This was war. And lucky for me, I'd just found the HOA's Achilles pipe. At 3:07 a.m., I woke up to the sound of a diesel engine humming like a mosquito with a grudge. You ever hear something so wrong it jolts you from sleep like your soul already knows something's been stolen? I looked out the window, and sure enough, there it was. A black truck parked at the edge of Lake Oliver with 2 men working hoses like they were draining a crime scene. No notice, no lights, no permits, just sweat, machinery, and silent guilt. They didn't even try to hide it. One of them avoided looking up, like he didn't want to make eye contact with the man whose legacy he was about to vacuum into a ditch. You could call it trespassing, vandalism, or theft, but it felt more like a funeral without a eulogy. And trust me, it was just the beginning. By the time I threw on boots and got outside, the water line had already dropped by a foot. Fish flopped in shallow mud, gasping like they too couldn't believe what was happening. The stench hit next. Wet sediment mixed with betrayal. It smelled like something sacred dying. My dad's chair sat where it always had, but instead of overlooking calm water, it now faced a receding shoreline and the mechanical gulp of the pump. I stood there frozen, too stunned to yell. I knew if I opened my mouth, something raw would come out, and Miriam would have just fined me for creating a hostile soundscape. The crew worked like they were on a deadline. Probably were. Probably paid in cash with instructions like, "Don't stop for anything." And the worst part? They didn't look proud. They looked like men doing something they hoped no one remembered. By sunrise, the truck was gone. But the damage had roots. What was once a vibrant little lake now looked like someone had spilled oil on Eden. I spent the next few hours dragging kiddie pools from the shed and trying to save the last surviving fish. Most didn't make it. The neighbors walked by, slower than usual, eyes forward like I was a stain on the sidewalk. I caught a glimpse of Susan across the street. She pulled her kid close and crossed to the other side. That one cut deeper than I expected. I'd taught her boy to fish last summer, helped her install a fence. Now I was the villain in a play Miriam directed, produced, and starred in. But what she didn't know, what no one knew, was that I still had my dad's old files, and somewhere in that dusty stack was a rule book sharp enough to gut her whole operation. I went back to the garage, hands shaking like they do when grief and rage shake hands. The HOA binders were just where I left them. Dad kept everything. Receipts, bylaws, hand-typed notes from meetings that probably could have been emails. I flipped through page after page until I landed on a set of invoices. Fake contractor names, no business license numbers, identical signatures. That's when it clicked. These weren't just skipped inspections. These were shell jobs. Paper trails designed to look like work had been done when it hadn't. And tucked in the back? Section 8 of the original HOA charter, mandatory yearly pipe inspections, recorded and publicly posted, which, based on what I'd seen and smelled, hadn't been done since smartphones came with headphone jacks. It was fraud disguised as maintenance. And Miriam had signed off on all of it. That's when Nate showed up. My best friend since high school, contractor by trade, chaos by nature. He stepped into the garage, took one look at the mess, and said, "She did it, didn't she?" I nodded. He walked to the edge of the now muddy lake and whistled low. "You know what's funny?" he said, tugging out his phone. "I fixed her irrigation system last year, documented the whole thing for the warranty. She made me redo it 3 times because the spray pattern didn't look aesthetic." He flipped through photos, smirking like a man who just remembered where the loose brick in the wall was. Let's just say I know every valve, every flaw, every dumb little shortcut she forced. If she wants a war, she just bought the first torpedo. And with that, the swamp plans began. But if you think Miriam's about to roll over, wait till you see what happens when the HOA queen finds mud in her marble entryway. Revenge doesn't always need fire, it just needs water pressure and a man with grudges stored like spare parts. Nate came over the next night with a toolkit, a grin, and a memory like a bitter elephant. "You know what she forgot?" he said, popping the back off Miriam's sprinkler controller like he was cracking a safe. "She made me redo this entire system 3 times. I know it better than she does." He leaned over the panel, flashlight clenched between his teeth, rerouting lines and nudging valves like he was conducting a swamp symphony. I kept watch from the side yard, heart pounding, nerves jangling like wind chimes in a storm. This wasn't vandalism. It was irrigation enlightenment. And when Nate whispered, "Done," it felt like justice had just clocked in. At exactly 4:15 a.m., The show began. Miriam's prized lawn, usually trimmed within half an inch of its life, began gurgling. Her precious rose beds, so pampered they probably had trust funds, were drowning under 6 inches of slow-moving muck. Sprinkler heads misfired in erratic patterns, spraying the sidewalk, the windows, and, when fate felt spicy, the decorative eagle statue that once glared at my mailbox. By 6:00 a.m., the entire front yard looked like it had been kissed by a swampy apocalypse. And then came the moment I'd been waiting for. Miriam stepping outside in silk pajamas and those designer heels, looking like she'd just walked out of a catalog and straight into quicksand. She made it 3 steps before one heel sank like a ship with a guilty conscience. The other followed, and when she tried to pull her foot free, she lost the shoe and nearly face-planted into what used to be her topiary. She shrieked a sound that was half fury, half wet sock, and turned in a circle, like a dog chasing its tail, trying to escape the creeping mud. I filmed the whole thing from my porch, coffee in hand, deadpan expression. "Morning, Miriam," I called. "Sprinkler's acting up." She pointed a mud-covered finger at me like I was the mastermind of an international conspiracy. "You did this!" she barked, hopping in place while her hair frizzed in real time. "Looks like old pipes to me," I said. "Probably a sign the HOA skipped some inspections." And just like that, a few curtains shifted open across the street. Susan Phelps stood at the sidewalk, mouth open, unable to decide whether to scream or applaud. Karen Tate, dressed in her usual athleisure armor, whispered something to her and barely stifled a laugh. That's when it happened. The shift. People who once nodded grimly at Miriam's every word now watched her struggle with mud-splattered heels and started seeing cracks in the porcelain. By noon, the footage had circulated through the neighborhood's group chat like wildfire through dry brush. Some added popcorn emojis. One neighbor suggested installing duck crossings. Miriam, of course, blamed system failure, external tampering, and sabotage. But the thing about controlling everything is people notice when you lose control. And her meltdown made it feel like, for the first time, we weren't alone. That same afternoon, Kendra dropped a manila envelope on my porch like it was radioactive. "You need to see this," she said, her voice low. Inside were HOA budget reports and maintenance bills she dug up through her bank contacts. And there it was, $4,800, 0 cents, paid last quarter for community pool maintenance. Small problem. We don't have a pool. Never had one, not even a kiddie version. I flipped the page. Landscaping fees paid to a company that didn't exist. Administrative bonuses marked confidential. It was a rat's nest of fake expenses and invisible projects. "She's been bleeding the HOA dry," Kendra whispered, "and blaming your lake to cover the mess." My stomach dropped, but my jaw tightened, because now we had something better than revenge. We had receipts. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the wilted hedges of Sunset Estates, I sat on my porch and replayed the video of Miriam's swamp dance. It looped like sweet petty poetry, but I wasn't smiling just for that. No, what made me grin was the growing realization that her empire wasn't just crooked. It was leaking. We had proof, we had people, and now we had momentum. Nate joined me with a 6-pack and a smirk. "She took your lake," he said, popping a cap. "And in return?" I nodded toward the yard where Miriam's sprinkler timer now flashed like a warning beacon. "She gave me hers." He raised his beer. I raised mine. And as I watched the mud bubble up through her flower beds, I said what had been sitting on my tongue since the pumps first ran. "You drown a lake, you better pray your pipes are clean." The email hit at 6:01 a.m. sharp. Subject line: urgent, vandalism and safety threat, immediate action required. I knew it was Miriam before I even opened it. That woman types like she speaks, condescending, dramatic, and with enough capital letters to make a ransom note blush. According to her, I wasn't just the guy with a drained lake anymore. I was now a domestic vandal. She wrote that I had willfully sabotaged HOA property and created dangerous conditions for multiple households. She even included a quote from her buddy on the advisory board, calling my behavior aggressive and retaliatory. And right beneath that, a conveniently cropped photo of her mud-covered lawn, taken at the exact moment her heel disappeared into swamp sludge. She called it deliberate flooding. I called it irony with a side of karma. The fallout was fast and cold. Neighbors I'd helped fix porch lights, who'd borrowed my snow shovel, who'd waved from across the street, now crossed the road like I carried the plague. I walked into the hardware store that afternoon and felt the chill before I touched the door. One regular, Dan Whitaker, who I once pulled out of a ditch in January, suddenly had somewhere urgent to be in aisle 5. A mom whose kid I'd taught to fish didn't even make eye contact. It was like being erased in slow motion. Susan Phelps walked past my driveway that evening, narrowed her eyes, and said, "We've all seen what you're capable of." "What's next? Colton? Fire?" Her fan club behind her gasped like I had matches in my pockets. I just stared at her. If I'd said anything, I might have laughed. And that would have only made it worse. But Miriam hadn't calculated one thing. Kendra Lowell doesn't back down from bullies. That night, she showed up at my door holding a banker's box full of trouble. "I've been doing some digging," she said, stepping inside like a woman with purpose. "And what I've found? It's not just shady, it's criminal adjacent." We dumped everything out on the kitchen table. Ghost invoices, vendor names with disconnected phone numbers, landscaping bills charged to a company that dissolved in 2012, multiple payments for pool maintenance. Still no pool. My head spun. "She's been faking the books," Kendra said, pointing to a printout. "Charging the HOA for services that never happened and pocketing the difference." Her voice was tight. "And blaming your lake to cover the gaps." That was the moment it shifted, from personal attack to full-blown conspiracy. Miriam wasn't just petty, she was profitable. As we sorted through page after page of financial acrobatics, I spotted something near the bottom of the stack. A faded blueprint tucked between two outdated budget reports. It was old. Older than Miriam's reign of clipboard terror. It showed the original layout of the neighborhood, and there, in the lower left corner, clearly labeled, Lake Oliver, approved flood control basin. My jaw clenched. "She called it a flood risk," I muttered. "But this says it was built to prevent flooding." Kendra leaned closer. "This was part of the original drainage plan. Removing it actually increases runoff risk. That's probably why everything's so unstable now." I stared at the page like it was a magic scroll. This wasn't just a mistake. It was strategic erasure. She drained the lake to erase liability, to clear a path, but for what? I sat back in Dad's old chair that night, the one now facing cracked mud instead of peaceful water, and stared out over what used to be serenity. Miriam had turned the neighborhood against me, rewritten the story, and sold herself as the victim. But she'd left a trail. Greasy fingerprints on every fake invoice, every skipped inspection, every rerouted dollar. I looked at Kendra across the table, surrounded by evidence and coffee-stained printouts. "She drained it for profit," I said. "And I'm about to bankrupt her lies." And just like that, the swamp wasn't the story anymore. The story was who stood to gain when the water disappeared, and what they'd lose when the truth came roaring back. Stay with me. We're just getting to the fun part. Turns out, HOA rule books are like old trapdoors. You don't notice them until someone falls through. After Kendra and I found the original bylaws buried beneath 2 decades of lies and lavender-scented newsletters, I filed a formal inspection request under Section 8.3, Annual Infrastructure Evaluations Required by Independent Municipal Authority. 5 years of missed inspections, hundreds of thousands in collected maintenance fees, 0 records. I slid the paperwork across Miriam's desk with the kind of grin that only comes from playing by the book, her book, and watching her eyes flicker like a busted porch light. She said it was unnecessary, disruptive, and borderline harassment. I said, page 17 disagrees. And just like that, The HOA's carefully buried skeletons started clawing their way back to the surface. The city inspector arrived 2 days later, clipboard in one hand, coffee in the other, and the expression of a man who's seen too many neighborhoods rot from the inside out. His name was Bill Jean, wore steel-toed boots and sarcasm like armor. He took one look at the storm drains and muttered, "Well, that ain't up to code." Within the hour, his team had marked half the sidewalks with orange spray paint. By the second hour, they found 3 illegally rerouted lines, 2 blocked mains, and a backup system that hadn't been touched since Obama's first term. Turns out, Miriam hadn't just skipped maintenance. She'd rerouted the neighborhood's drainage to give herself better water pressure. Like building a dam to water your lawn while your neighbors drown. Classic Miriam. Then came the collapse. It started at the Johnsons', a toilet that erupted like Old Faithful's nasty cousin, gray water in the basement, raw sewage in the laundry room. Next was the Millers'. Bathtub backed up with something that should have stayed in 1997. And then, sweet poetic justice, Miriam's home. Her marble-tiled, aromatherapy-scented palace of perfection. Sewage gushed from under her foundation like a horror movie with plumbing. Her sprinkler system sparked and shorted. Lawn lights exploded like 4th of July bottle rockets. By the time she opened her front door, mud had infiltrated every inch of her pristine flower beds and was slowly invading her foyer like it paid rent. She screamed like someone just repossessed her ego. Nate stood beside me on my porch, arms crossed, phone in hand, filming every second with the steady hand of a man who'd been waiting his whole life for this. "Swamp justice," he said, panning across the chaos like a proud director. "She flooded your past. You just flooded her future." He uploaded the footage to the neighborhood group chat with a caption that simply read, "Maintenance matters." Within minutes, it spread faster than mold in Miriam's drywall. Neighbors who hadn't spoken to me in weeks suddenly started sending emojis. A few asked questions, a couple apologized. One even brought over brownies. There's something about seeing a tyrant sink into her own lies that reminds people who the real villain was all along. That night, I sat on my back porch, same old wooden chair, sipping coffee and listening to the distant sound of wet vacs and panic echoing through Sunset Estates. The lake was still dry, cracked like old leather, but the tide was turning, figuratively and very, very literally. Miriam had turned my sanctuary into a desert, but I'd turned her throne into a swamp. And the irony, it was all by the book. Her book. She'd weaponized the rules for years, but never expected anyone to read the fine print. Her roses, gone. Her lawn, a breeding ground for mosquitoes and shame. And her reputation? Oh, her reputation bloomed beautifully, right there in 3 feet of untreated karma. Stay close. The best part's coming, and it smells like justice. 3 weeks after sewage turned Miriam's garden party into a biohazard event, I got served. A process server in a sad-looking blazer handed me the thickest stack of legal threats I'd ever seen. Miriam was suing me for property damage, HOA defamation, and, my personal favorite, intentional community sabotage. She might as well have accused me of witchcraft while she was at it. Buried in the fine print was a little bonus clause, a motion to permanently bar me from holding any future HOA office or restoring the lake. Translation, she wasn't just trying to win, she wanted me erased, like a typo in her suburban fairy tale. But, unlike her, I came to court with more than theatrics. I came with evidence and a lawyer who sharpened her arguments like they were knives. Janine Crowder was exactly the kind of woman Miriam hated. Soft-spoken but razor-sharp, never wore pearls, didn't flinch under pressure, and never used 10 words when 3 would do. She reviewed Miriam's proof like a cat inspecting a broken toy. The key piece? A backdated pipe inspection form with a contractor's stamp that didn't exist until last year. Janine raised one eyebrow and said, "That's cute," before building a timeline so tight it could have been sold as a noose. "Your Honor," she said calmly, "this form references a company that was legally incorporated 18 months after the alleged inspection date. Unless we're entertaining time travel, this document is a forgery." The judge didn't smile, but his pen paused long enough to let me know he was listening. Then came the audio. I pulled out my phone, clicked play, and Miriam's voice filled the courtroom like a soap opera confession. "No one checks dates. I drained that lake, pocketed the funds, and made it look official. These people believe whatever I print on HOA letterhead." Gasps echoed from the gallery. One of the jurors blinked like she'd just seen a ghost. The judge adjusted his glasses. "And Miriam?" She went pale enough to match the marble floors she used to brag about. Her lawyer tried to object. Context, privacy, irrelevant. But Janine handed the judge 3 notarized affidavits confirming the date, source, and voice authentication. It was airtight. Miriam's carefully curated empire was cracking like her garden tiles. But the final cracks came from her own people. Cliff Reynard stood up during witness testimony, cleared his throat, and said, "She threatened to fine me for speaking up about the budget, called me incompetent in front of the board. I didn't want to cause trouble, but this is bigger than a mailbox color." Then came Karen Tate, shaking slightly as she held up a signed blank HOA form. "She told me it was for meeting minutes," Karen said. "But I saw my signature on a maintenance authorization last week. I never approved that." The jury leaned forward like they were watching a true crime docuseries in real time. Even Susan Phelps started shifting in her seat, her loyalty wobbling like heels on swampy ground. Janine closed with one clean strike. Miriam Dorsey weaponized an HOA to serve her own interests. She forged documents, fabricated inspections, silenced dissent, and misused community funds. This wasn't about safety, it was about power. The judge nodded once and asked if the defense had anything to add. I stood, looked right at Miriam and said she forged papers, she forged rules, and now she's forging a signature on her mugshot. The gallery murmured. Miriam's lawyer paled. And in that moment, I saw the end coming, not just for her case, but for the kingdom she built out of fear and fines. Stay tuned, because justice is about to get real personal. If this story hit home, or reminded you of something you or someone you know is going through, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with a friend who needs to hear it. These HOA nightmares aren't just drama. They're real lessons in standing your ground. And if you've got thoughts, experiences, or just need to vent, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear what you think. It's funny how fast a queen becomes a cautionary tale when the water turns brown and the neighbors stop pretending. Miriam's once pristine palace had become a full-on bog. Her front yard? Gone. Her flower beds? Soggy graves. Her sprinkler system? Shorted so bad it looked like it was trying to cook the grass. And the crown jewel? A stream of raw sewage that oozed straight through her decorative stone path like nature itself had decided to evict her. At first, she tried to stay above it, literally, tiptoeing through the mess in overpriced rubber boots. But mud has a way of making everyone equal. And Miriam? She looked real average, covered in runoff and regret. The video Nate filmed of her slipping into the mire went viral faster than an HOA rumor. He titled it "Swamp Queen of Willow Run," and it racked up views like free donuts at a city council meeting. There she was, slipping, screeching, throwing a rake at her garden hose like it was sentient. And then came the cherry on top. The hose whipped back, knocked over her flaming tiki torch, and set a patch of decorative grass on fire. The whole neighborhood watched it unfold in glorious 1080p. 1 minute she was the iron-fisted queen of fines, and the next she was screaming, "Call the fire department!" with her eyeliner running and her dog tracking mud into the house she'd once banned kids from entering with dirty shoes. Oh, the irony. So sweet it almost tasted like justice. That weekend, the neighbors gathered on her lawn, not for support, but for a reckoning. Susan Phelps was the first to speak. "You started this," she said, standing knee-deep in puddle water with her sandals ruined. "You drained the lake, and now we're all drowning." Karen Tate followed, waving a soggy insurance denial letter in the air. "My company says this isn't flood damage, it's negligent infrastructure sabotage." "They're not paying a cent." Others joined in. raising bills, photographs, and whatever trust they had left, all of it washed away. Miriam stood frozen in her doorway, bathrobe hanging limp, mascara smudged like war paint. "This wasn't my fault," she croaked. "It was his." She pointed toward me, but this time no one turned. The real break came when Susan turned to her and said, "Pack your things, you're done here." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried, and the silence that followed was louder than any courtroom gavel. Miriam tried to speak, but her words drowned in the sound of kids chanting, "Bye, Swamp Queen," from their bikes. And, wouldn't you know it, even the squirrels seemed to pause and listen. That afternoon, the moving truck arrived. The poor guys tried their best, but wheeling furniture through sludge is about as graceful as dragging a sofa through quicksand. Her velvet chairs looked more like damp regrets. The grand piano? Water-warped and listing like a ship with no anchor. She didn't wave goodbye. She just climbed into the front seat, pulled the door shut, and stared straight ahead while her empire sank behind her. That night, I sat by the dry basin of Lake Oliver, the moon reflecting off cracked earth and puddles of rain runoff that would one day be a lake again. Nate handed me a beer. Kendra leaned back in Dad's old chair. "So," she said, "what do we call this chapter?" I took a sip and smiled. Her legacy? A garden of broken trust and floating lawn chairs. We laughed. Not the kind of laugh you post online, but the quiet kind you earn. The kind that tells you even if the story isn't quite over, at least the villain's out of the frame, but stick around. Because just when you think the swamp's been drained, there's always one more gator waiting in the reeds. 3 weeks after Miriam's moving truck splashed out of town, Lake Oliver started breathing again. The restoration crew showed up with pumps, permits, and just enough grit to match the fight it took to get them there. Water trickled back in like a slow apology, filling the cracks, covering the scars, reminding us all that some things come back stronger after you fight for them. I sat in my dad's old chair, now sanded, sealed, and bolted to the deck, watching the ripples stretch across the lake like time folding in on itself. Peace had returned, or so I thought. But if there's one thing I've learned in this saga, it's that some weeds in a neighborhood don't die. They just change shape and show up with a new signature at the bottom of the letter. It came in a thick white envelope with gold lettering and a logo that looked suspiciously familiar. The new HOA board was pleased to announce interim leadership under Richard Lane, Miriam's old lawyer. Yep, the same guy who tried to convince a courtroom that a sewage fountain was an act of God. He'd apparently been elected unanimously during a special meeting no one could seem to remember attending. Inside the packet, proposed bylaw amendments that read like a dictatorship with better fonts, increased authority for emergency inspections, discretionary fines without prior notice, and a new section titled Waterway Management Oversight. That last one nearly made me spit out my coffee. You'd think after one scandal they'd stop trying to control the lake, but control is a funny thing. The more people lose it, the harder they scramble to get it back. I walked the neighborhood that afternoon, packet in hand, and noticed the same old tension hanging in the air like summer humidity. Some folks avoided eye contact, some whispered, a few gave the half nod of, "Don't bring me into this." But then Karen Tate waved me over with a copy of her own letter. "They're trying again," she said. "Same old tricks, new name on the envelope." And this time, people weren't as afraid. Susan Phelps, freshly unfanned and soggy in reputation, even admitted maybe we should have asked more questions the first time. The shift was subtle but real, because once you've seen the queen fall in her own swamp, it's hard to bow to the next monarch just because they changed their shoes. Back at the house, Nate and Kendra sat with me at the lakeside picnic table, going line by line through the new proposals. Nate, still covered in paint from rebuilding the community sign Miriam once called visually chaotic, shook his head. "This smells like a second season we didn't ask for." Kendra smiled without humor. "Then we treat it like a sequel, with better preparation, a sharper cast, and no mercy." I looked out at the lake, now almost full again, the sun reflecting off the surface like nothing bad had ever touched it. But I knew better. This time we weren't fighting alone. The neighborhood had seen what happens when power goes unchecked. They saw the price of silence. And this time, they'd show up. So when the next HOA meeting was announced, held at the community center, same room that once echoed with Miriam's threats, I made sure we packed the place. I brought photos, receipts, and a laminated copy of Section 8, like it was the neighborhood's Declaration of Independence. Kendra brought spreadsheets, Nate brought sarcasm, and the people, they brought questions, real ones, the kind Richard Lane couldn't answer without sweating through his sport coat. Turns out, tyrants don't do well in bright lights, especially when the swamp they're trying to build already has a history. I stood, let the silence settle, and then I said, "We beat one tyrant, we'll beat another. Some HOA snakes just shed their skin. But don't worry, I still know how to flood 'em out." And as I sat there that evening, in my father's chair, beside a lake that almost didn't survive, I realized something simple but sacred. Sometimes justice isn't loud, it's patient. It's quiet. Like water returning to cracked earth. Miriam tried to drain legacy, Richard tried to repackage control. But truth always floats back to the surface, no matter how deep someone tries to bury it. What started as a lake became a line in the sand, a reminder that no piece of water, no patch of land, and no small voice is too small to fight for. This wasn't just a story about fines or bylaws or mud-caked designer heels. This was about the cost of silence and the reward of standing up when no one else will. About how bullies don't always wear leather jackets and ride motorcycles. Sometimes they wear cardigans and carry clipboards. And most of all, it's about legacy. My dad taught me how to fish, how to fix things, and how to stand tall without shouting. Today I stood tall. For him, for me, and for every neighbor who forgot they had a voice. And I promise you this, if they try it again, they better bring better boots. Because I've already mapped every pipe, every flaw, every loophole in that precious charter. I won't be surprised twice, and I won't be quiet again. So if this story felt like yours, if you've ever faced a clipboard tyrant or been told to shrink where you should have stood tall, share this video with someone who needs it. A neighbor, a friend, someone whose story still feels stuck in the mud, because maybe they're just waiting for a little proof that they're not alone. And maybe this is it. Drop a comment and tell me what you think, what you'd have done, what you learned, or what you've survived. I read every one. Don't forget to like this story if it gave you something worth thinking about. And if you want more real stories about real people taking their power back one rule at a time, subscribe. The next episode? Let's just say the HOA has no idea what's coming. Until then, protect your peace, read your bylaws, and always keep a wrench near the water main. You never know when the next Swamp Queen's gonna rise. All right, now it's your turn. What HOA horror story should I tackle next? Got a neighbor from hell? A board president who thinks they're the mayor? Or maybe your own Swamp Queen moment? Drop it in the comments. What would you like me to do next? Your ideas might just be the next story featured right here. And trust me, we've only scratched the surface.